Evening, everyone. This is Vikas Srivastav again, founder and CTO at AlmaBetter. So I hope you all are having a great day. Uh, so as people who have been attending this program for the last 2 days, right? So I hope you are really excited about this journey. So we are on our third day of the first week, and this is the first module, right? So the first module is going to be Python for data science, and we'll be covering all the Python fundamentals which are required for understanding data science. All right. So, in the last 2 days, we have talked about very important concepts in Python, right? So we started on the first day with an introduction to different data types which are supported in Python. We talked about integers, floats, and booleans, right? And then yesterday we talked about specifically about strings, and we learned about how we can do some operations on string, as in, let's say if I want to find the index, or if I want to slice the string. Okay, we also looked at important functions and methods which can do some operation on top of a list, right? So we understood all these important concepts yesterday, and so I hope you guys have completed your assignments, and so you have a refreshed memory of what these concepts are, right? So we introduced a very important concept yesterday, that is the idea of indexing in Python, right? So before we discussed about indexing, I introduced you to the concept of a sequence, right? So a concept of a sequence is really important in Python, and today we'll be learning about list objects, right? So there are various data structures in Python. So list is one of them, and is in fact one of the most important data structure, which will help make our life a lot easier. And then tomorrow we'll be talking about tuple sets and dictionaries. So these are some different data structures. So all these data structures have been designed to handle how we can handle information, right? So how can we process information, and there should be a lot of flexibility with us, right? How we want to operate. So list will have some set of methods and functions associated with it, so that we can perform some operations on them. And then tuples will have some different based on their definition and what kind of problems or operations they can handle, right? So data structures, all these data structures, if you talk about list, sets, dictionaries, tuples, so they all are designed for a specific set of purposes, right? So in a particular scenario where a tuple might not come useful, a list will definitely come out to be, right? So you'll realize the importance of data structure in Python. So the whole idea is we want to process the information in very clever ways, right? And that's why we have these data structures built in Python, which can make our life easier. And Python recognizes whether a particular object is list, or whether it's a tuple, or whether it's a dictionary, or it's a string, right? So all those things Python understands, and we need to make the best choices how we can pass one information from here and there, and that will help or make our lives quite easy, right? So I just want to know from you guys, so whenever you hear this term lists, right? So this is not the first time you're hearing the term list, right? So you have been hearing about, so you make a list of items, you make a list of wishes, right? So there's a wish list you'll find on every e-commerce website, right? So I just want you to tell me what kind of scenarios you can imagine when you hear the term list, as in what sort of data that we can try to process or store in a list, right? So I'm sending a link. Okay, so just mention your answer here, right? So just give me, I want different scenarios where we can utilize the information in, let's say, a list of values, right? So what sort of things can we do, right? So I want you to tell me real applications, right, where this might turn out to be quite meaningful, right? So we're using list all the time, right? There are a lot of different. So Ankit is saying list of weeks, okay. Prashant is saying task priority list, okay. List of passengers, right? So let's say if you want to have information about a train flying from one station to another, right? And in a consolidated fashion, you can have the data for all the trains which are running from one location to different location across India, right? So if you wanted to create a database, and there for a particular trip, you'll need to note the list of passengers, right? So that's a good example. List of temperature variations. That's Sanchita. That's brilliant. Yeah, answer. Right. So where in weather forecasting, we are constantly using, uh, right. So there are different time periods across the day in which we want to monitor and get information about what the temperature is, what the humidity is, right? So there are different weather variables or factors that will be important in assessing how the weather is going to be in, let's say, in next day or over the course of next week, right? A list of students in class, yes. So because you guys are going to be data scientists, right, in some time, or right? So I need you to think, how can we use this concept of list, right? So just imagine it's a list of values. How can we use this list? And let's say if I want to do some experiments and store information, collect some observations, and go through them, right? So bundle of items, all right. So grocery list, this could be okay. Uh, List of ingredients, okay. So whenever a list of items in the menu, right? So whenever you are um, ordering on Swiggy, right? So you have a list of restaurants, and then for each restaurant you have the list of food items available there. So right, so lists are sort of ubiquitous. They are universal. They are present across whatever we can think of and quantify. Right? So everything we can sort of boil down to list, right? So they are just a bunch of numbers, and we can quantify some important data using list, right? So list of medicines, right? List of products in the storeroom, right? So if you're managing a warehouse, you need to keep track of which items you are getting on a regular basis, on, let's say, on daily basis, right? So you need to log these information in a list of in a list, right? So that will be a list of values. So those values will correspond to, let's say, number of uh, products purchased from a particular store, right? So all those things we can use list to store such information. Okay, so thanks a lot, people, for providing your inputs. Okay, so I'll just clear this blank slate. Okay. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, so now we want to talk about list specifically. What is a list in Python? Okay, so the first important point is list. They can be thought of as the most general version of a sequence in Python. Okay, so yesterday we stumbled upon this concept of sequence, right? So when we talked about string, and if you take a particular example, let's say Joker, right? So every character in that string, that occupies a certain position or place, right? So the first element is J, the second element is O, the third element is K, right? And we learned about this concept of index, where the index refers to the location of an element, and indexing starts with 0 in Python, right? So the first element will always correspond to the location or index 0, right? So similarly, whenever we encounter this idea of, or have a notion of sequence, the index will come into picture, right? So whenever you have this concept of sequence, because the elements are arranged in a particular fashion, so every element you want to point out, you can reference or find out that element or retrieve that element by providing the index, right? So whenever we talk about sequence, we'll be dealing with indexes, right? Because in a sequence, location of an element matters, and the location will be defined by the choice of our index, right? We could have started uh, with index from 1, right? But in Python, the developers chose to start with 0, right? It makes sense for a lot of different uh, operations or objects which will be dealing in Python, right? So the next important point is, unlike strings, they are mutable. So we learned a very important property of string yesterday, that they are immutable, right? So they cannot be changed. Of course, we can do some operation on a string and store that in another variable. That is a different thing. But If I just apply a method on a string, it will not change the string, because yesterday we saw numerous examples where we applied a particular method such as lower, but it didn't change my original string. It showed the corresponding output, but it did not change my original string. So that is what we mean by immutability. But unlike strings, list objects, they are mutable. Okay, meaning the elements inside a list can be changed. Not only the elements inside the list can be changed, the length of a list can also be changed. There are a lot of different operations we can do on a list, and they are mutable, right? So whenever you do some operation, let's say using a list method, that will bring about a change in your list. Okay, so we'll be covering all these important methods and the properties of list today. So just bear with your, just curb your curiosity for now. So the third important point is list, they are constructed with brackets. Okay, so this is a very important. So this is the way we define a list. Okay, so whatever elements which will be having in a list, they will be written in a square bracket. Okay, and every element will be separated by a comma. Okay, so let's take an example of the first list that we'll encounter in Python. So that is, I'm creating a variable which I'm calling as my list, and this is again a perfectly valid variable name. And then I have a equal to sign, which means we are assigning a value to this particular variable. And what is the value which we are assigning? So the value is nothing but a list. Okay, or in fact you can call that a list of elements, right, or list of values. So in this case, how do we define a list? So we have square brackets. Okay, so this is the first step. So how do you define a list? You need to write the square brackets, and then within the square brackets, you specify your element, such as let's say 10, comma 2, comma 30, comma 4, right? So all the elements will be separated by comma. This is very important. So how do we create a list? We write square brackets, and then within the square brackets, we'll write the elements which we want to store in that list. And all these elements, they will be separated by comma. So in this case, I'm storing a bunch of numerals or numeric values, but we can store anything however we want, right? So we can store a text, we can store a list within a list, right? So we can do a lot of things, but because this is your first example, so this is a list in which we have 4 elements, right? So 10, 2, 30, 4, right? So we have 4 elements in this list. So let's go ahead and execute this cell. You remember how do we run a cell in Jupyter or Colab notebook? So we press Shift plus Enter. Okay, so this executes this particular piece of code. Now if you try to inspect what is there in the variable my list, so we can do that just by printing that list, okay, or variable. And as you can see, the my list is a list of values, right? And if you try to print out the type of this variable my list, so let's go ahead and do this. So this will be list. Okay, it will be list. All right, so the type, so list is a recognized data type in Python, and whenever you create any variable in which you are assigning a value using this particular method, right? So you write something like square brackets, and then within that you store different elements separated by comma. So Python will recognize that as a list. Okay, so when you print out the type of this list, okay, so it will yield list. All right, so here we created a list of integers, but of course lists are much more generalizable. They can actually hold different object types. For example, I've created another list. The variable name is of course the same, but it is another list, so it will overwrite. That's the meaning of the variable, in fact. Okay, so in this list I have how many elements? So I have this one element, this one, this one, this one, this one, right? So total of 5 elements we have. So now as you can see, the first element is not a number, but it's a string. Okay, so it's a string. The second element is a number. The third, or in integer, in fact, the third is float. Fourth is of course a string only, and the fifth is a Boolean variable, right? So this true is a Boolean variable. Okay, so list can actually hold objects of different data types. Okay, so here this element is a string, we have integers and we have floats, right? We also have booleans. We can have a list of strings. There are a lot of different data types that can be stored in a list. Okay, so I hope you understand this important concept. Okay, so let's go ahead and execute this cell. Okay, and we can print what's contained in my list. So we can call the print function, but here I'm just writing my list. Okay, and as you can see, yeah, so my list has 5 elements, and and these are, so we have two string elements, and then we have two numeric elements, and then one we have boolean, right? So moving ahead, so just like strings, the length function will tell you how many items are in the sequence of the list, right? So, but because you know that there are n number of elements in your list, right? So we can find out what's the size of the list or the length of the list just by calling the len function, right? So in the case of string, we provided the string within the parenthesis, and it gave us the number of characters in a list. And here also we can provide the list variable name here, which is my list. And if we execute this, so this will yield 5, as in there are 5 elements in our list. Okay, so if I update this list, so maybe let's say if I add another element, let's say 45. Okay, so now my list has 6 elements, and I can confirm by just by running this particular cell. So here we're trying to find the length of our list, and I added one element. So the length of the list is now 6, right? So length is nothing but how many elements or items there are in a list. One important thing is we can have multiple, so we can have 23 here as well, even though 23 is here, but because an element is referred by the location where it is present in the list, right? Because we are dealing with the notion of sequence. So this 23 is at index 1, but this 23 is at index 5. Okay, so they are different elements, even though they have the same value, but they are different elements. Okay, so this is a really important concept, and you should understand the importance of it, right? So we can have duplicate elements, but we need to identify those elements by their relative indexes. Okay, so even two elements can have the same values, but they will be different elements because they occupy different positions in your list. Okay, which, and consequently the index for these two elements will be different. Okay, so okay, so now we understand what does the len function gives us as an output. So it tells us the number of elements present in our list. All right, so moving ahead, a very similar concept as what we have already discussed yesterday related to strings. So we understood a very important concept of indexing, and you know how what indexing is, right? So I'll just try to give you a brief recap. So indexing is very similar, just like in strings, right? A list index refers to the location of an element in a list. All right, so this is pretty straightforward. So a list index will point to the location of an element in a list. So an index value 0 will correspond to the first element of our list. An index value of -1 will correspond to the last element of our list. Okay, so these things are pretty much the same as what we have discussed in strings. Then the next point is the indexing begins from 0 in Python. Needless to say, I have said this particular statement million times, right? So indexing begins from 0 in Python. Okay, and another point is the first element is of course assigned an index of 0, the second element is assigned an index of 1, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is how indexing works in list. Okay, so let's take some examples and try to do some operations, retrieve some elements of our list, and these concepts will become really clear to you. Okay, so here I'm considering a list of strings. Okay, so all the elements are strings in my list. Okay, what's the name of my list variable? So I'm calling them loss functions. Okay, so don't worry about if these terms you have not heard before, right? So loss functions will be covering in machine learning, right? So this is a really important concept, but I just wanted to have a list of strings, and this is what I came up with. So the name of the variable is loss functions, and we have created a list. So how do we create a list? So we provide square brackets, and within square brackets we write the elements separated by comma. Okay, so the first element is what I'm calling as mean absolute error. So this is the first element of our list, loss functions. Mean square, right? So this is the second element of our list, loss functions. Then Hubert loss is the third element, log loss is the fourth element, and hinge loss is the fifth element, right? So bunch of strings in our list, which is called loss functions here, right? So we can print loss functions and see what it gives us, right? So nothing different, it's the same thing, right? So there are 5 elements. So now I want to grab the first element of my list. Okay, so how do I do that? So I write the I'm let's say, let's ignore the print statement for now. Okay, so I write the name of my list variable, which is loss functions, right? So I write it here, and then I provide square brackets. Okay, so remember from yesterday that if you wanted to retrieve a particular element, or if you wanted to do a slice, we needed to provide the square brackets, right? And in square brackets we need to provide the index, right? So in loss functions, we write square brackets, and in the square brackets I mention the index, and this will return me the element sitting at that index, or element located at that index, right? So let's go ahead and execute this cell. And yeah, so this is a mean absolute error, and as you can see, there are quotes here, right? And if you use a print statement, so it will print without quote, right? So as you can see, the first element is mean absolute error. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. Now let's try to retrieve the element sitting at a different index. So what about the element sitting at index 3? Okay, so the same thing, I write the name of my list variable, provide the square brackets, and then I write the index corresponding to which I want to retrieve the element, right? So I want to get the element at index 3. So I have 3 here, and let's see what it returns. So this returns log loss, which you can guess, this is the fourth element of our list, right? So this is the 0th index, this is the first index, second and third, right? And if we talk in plain English, so this is the first element, this is the second element, the third one, the fourth one, and the fifth one, right? So I hope this is pretty much clear to you guys, right? Now, how do we grab the last element of our list? So I can write the name of my list variable again, and then within the square brackets, I can specify the index corresponding to the last element. And you know from the earlier class that the index for the last element can be written as -1. Okay, so I'll provide -1 within the square brackets and execute this cell, and this will give me the last element, which is hinge loss. And as you can verify that this is the last element in our list, right? So a list is nothing but a sequence of elements. Okay, so they are arranged in a specific fashion, and the sequence is very important, as in if you want to get a particular element at a particular index, so we can use that notion of sequence consolidated by the concept of index. Okay, so let's repeat this particular element. Okay, so let's write this here. Okay, so I'm just repeating this element, and for a purpose which I want to show you, right? So here we have 6 elements, and if you want to print right, so -1, so this should return you hinge loss. If I print -2, so this will again return hinge loss, right? So the values can be repeated, but because they are sitting at different index, right, or different locations, so they are different elements. Okay, so that's the concept, right? So it's just like saying that there are 2 people named Raj, but one person is sitting in Bangalore, the other person is sitting in Delhi NCR, right? Something like that. Okay, so guys, can you please mute yourself? All right, so moving ahead, so I hope you have understood the concept of indexing in a list. Can you guys please chat privately to me and say, yeah, if you have understood the concept of indexing for lists, right? So pretty much the same thing as we have discussed earlier for strings, right? So yes, so I think I'm pretty confident to move ahead, right? So all right, so let's discuss the slicing, how we can do slicing in list. Again, this will be very similar to what we have discussed in strings. Okay, so we can use a colon to perform slicing, which grabs everything up to a designated point. Okay, so this you already know from the last class. The starting index is specified on the left of the colon, and the ending index is specified on the right of the colon. Okay, so this you already know, nothing new here. And remember, the element located at the right index is not included. So whenever we do a slicing, right, or whenever we do a slice, the element located at the right index, that will not be included in the slice, right? So that is the case. Okay, so let's change our loss functions. I just wanted to demonstrate this, as in we can have different elements with the same value, but so now I can check what my list variable loss function contains, right? So it contains 5 elements now, and if I want to grab all the elements, so grab the second element, third element, and the fourth element, right? So what should I do? So you write the name of your list variable, and then in the square brackets, so what should be your starting index? Because starting index is included. So if I start gathering the elements from the second element, right? So I can provide the index value 1, which of course refers to the second element. And then I provide colon, and then after colon, I write the index 4, right? But it will not include the element sitting at the index 4 in the slice, right? So what elements will this particular slice operation do or grab? So the second element, the third element, and the fourth element, and not the fifth element, because fifth element corresponds to the index 4, and that will not be included in the slice, right? So element at index 4 will not be included in the slice. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so so this is mean squared error, which is the second element, Hubbard loss, which is the second, which is the third element of our list, and then log loss, which is the fourth element, right? And as you can see, the fifth element, hinge loss, which corresponds to the index 4, has not been returned in the slice operation. Okay, so I hope you understand this important concept. Okay, so now guys, can you tell me, let's say if I want to extract all the elements apart from the first element. Okay, so can you write here? Okay, so just delete your previous one. Okay, so just write here in the Padlet. Okay, so if I want to grab all the elements, but I don't want the first element, I want all the elements apart from the first one. So what should I do? How can we do the slicing? Okay, so the list name, and then within the square brackets we'll write 1 colon, right? So you are not specifying anything in the ending index, and as you know, right, if you do not specify the ending index, it will grab all the elements that come after the starting index, right, and including the starting index, right? So 1, so let's just run this. Okay, so this will return all the elements which comes after the first element, right? So mean absolute error will not be fetched or grabbed in the slice operation, but all the elements that come after it. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. And again, if you do not specify the ending index, then all elements are extracted which comes after the starting index, including the element at that index, starting index, right? So the element at starting index is included, but not the one at the ending index. So when you do not specify the ending index, the slice operation knows only to stop when it has run through the entire list. Okay, so once it has exhausted the list, so it will stop there. Okay, so now can you tell me what will I get if I write loss functions and within the square bracket I write 8? So what do you think will I get? Can you write your answers here again? So I'll just delete this and then you can start answering. Okay, so just wait hang on for a second. Okay, so now you can start answering here. So what will happen? So if I write something like loss functions, then within the square bracket I write 8. And remember, the loss functions has only 5 elements, right? So index out of bound, index out of range. Okay, okay. Let's try to do that. So I'll just add a code cell here. Okay, so if you write loss function, so the Python will automatically suggest you, yeah, this is the variable you want to work with, right? So it's pretty handy. So you don't have to write the entire function, entire variable name on your own. So Python automatically detects it from the environment. So loss functions is here, and then I can write the square brackets, and I want to obtain the element at 8th index, right? Index 8 or the 9th element, and right. So this gives me again the same error as we had encountered in strings. So the index error, list index out of range. Okay. What about so now tell me, what will I get when I do this? So if I write loss functions 1 colon 8, right? So grab everything which is between these two indexes. So what will that give us, right? So okay, so let's try and run this, right? So it returns me all the elements, right? So because it knows that there are no elements after the index value 4, so it does not even consider, right? So it handles that particular error, and it returns me all the element because the ending index exceeds the number of elements in our list, and it does not bother Python much, right? So it says that, of course, yeah, you've gone uh, above your list, right? So you've gone beyond your list, and let's grab all the elements till the end. Okay, so that's the thing, and yeah. So moving forward, so if I want to grab everything starting from index 2, so I can write within square brackets 2, then I write colon, and I can choose not to define the ending index, right? So it will gather all the elements that come after the index 2 and including that as well. Okay, so now can you guys tell me, so I'll just clear this node space again. So I have another question for you. So let's say if I want to grab uh, the last 5 elements, so what do you think we should do, right? So I want to grab the last 5 elements, right? So can you tell me what should I do, right? So I'm seeing some answers. uh, Okay, so imagine that your list can have as many values as possible. So maybe you can consider that your list has, let's say, 10,000 values, right? So there are 10,000 elements in your list. So how do you grab the last 5 elements? So I'm getting a really good answer from a lot of people. So some are writing, so square brackets. So Rajat is writing, is still writing. Okay, so let's look at this Santa. So he has written -5 colon and nothing, right? So Drisanta has opted to not specify the ending index. So this slicing will start with the element located at index -5, and then it will grab all the elements that come after it, right? So we have not specified the starting index, ending index. So let's try to do that. So if I try to write -5 here, okay, so it will grab the last 5 elements, right? So as you can see, yeah, it displays in this fashion. Okay, so maybe we can have -4 here too, right? So this will give me, right, the last 4 elements, right? So this is pretty straightforward, and again, as the same as when we had discussed that if your index is greater than the number of elements in your list, so it will be throwing a list index out of range, right? Similar with the negative index, right? So -10, there is no element with index -10, so this will throw an error, right? And this is the error, what is known as index error, because the list index which has been provided, that's out of range, right? So for loss functions list, Python only knows the index from 0 to 4, right? It does not know if there is an element at 10 because we have exhausted the list, or right? So you get the idea. It should also be noted that list indexing will return an error if there's no element in that index. Of course, yeah, we got understood this particular point here. All right. So now let's talk about list operations. So I hope you guys are now comfortable with slicing and indexing operations in list. Uh, yeah. So can you please mention yes over the chat? All right. So I think, yeah, most of you have got it, and that's quite encouraging. So now let's talk about a lot of different list operations that we can do. So remember, we said that lists are mutable as opposed to strings, and so we'll be dealing with different methods which will change your list entirely. Okay, so we'll be looking at that. But before we jump onto that, let's consider basic operations and go through them and see what things we can do. Okay, so I'll just print my loss functions. So you are aware about what elements we have in list and how many elements are there, right? So currently we have 5 elements in our list. I'm emphasizing on this point. I am printing loss functions every time as a check, because if you do any operation, your list or object will get changed, right? So we need to keep track that our original list is what we have already provided. Okay, so that's why I'm printing it, so that you can see what's happening, right? So there are 5 elements as above, right? So we have not made any changes as of now, right? Now what we can do, we can concatenate two lists just like strings, right? So remember yesterday, if you wanted to add two strings, so what I did, right? So I did something like ABC, and then I write it plus, and then I write it DEF, and this gives me a concatenated string which is ABCDEF, right? So this was pretty straightforward in string. It will be pretty straightforward in list as well. Okay, so suppose how can you add or concatenate elements to a list? So you write the name of the list which you already have. So in our case, this is loss functions, and then I can write plus, and then I can write another list. So here, this is another list which has 2 elements. So the first element is something called Gulbuck Libler, and the second element is XYZ. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so now these 2 elements have been added to our list, but of course, this does not change our list. Only methods will do. So, okay, so as you can see, these are 5 elements, and here we tried adding 2 elements, and they were properly concatenated to our list. Okay, so if we find the length of this particular list, right, so this will be 7. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. So you can concatenate a list to an existing list. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. So nothing new about it, similar to how we learned about concatenation in strings. Okay, as I already told you, so this doesn't actually change the original list. All right, so you can see our loss functions is again a bunch of 5 elements. Now we can do this. So let's say if I write loss functions here, and I write equal to sign, and then I write something like loss functions plus, let's say, this particular element. So I want to add just 1 element or concatenate 1 element to our list, which is loss function. But as you can see, loss functions is here. So I'm trying to update that particular loss function. So let's say if this works. Okay, so now, so this initially had these 5, right? So this particular, how this is working. So let's consider this. So this loss functions was initially this list of 5 elements. Okay, now we added 1 new element, so it gave me a concatenated list of 6 elements, right? Now I'm assigning that list to the same variable, which is loss functions. Okay, so let's go ahead and print this particular variable, and now as you can see, so this element has been added in our list, right? So this is another a way to make change in your list if you want to add an element. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. And okay, now let's look at some other operation. So concatenation works really fine for list, and then we can also use the star for a duplication method similar to strings, right? So let's print our loss function. Okay, so I've already printed it above, right? So these are the 6 elements. Now let's say okay, so let's say if I multiply my list, which is loss functions, and I write something like star and then 3. So I want to multiply my list 3 times. So let's see what it yields, right? So it yields a list of these many elements, and you can find, of course, you can guess, right? So how many elements it will have. So let's just check that for clarity. And the length of this particular list is 11. Okay, so I hope yeah, uh, this particular concept is clear to you guys, right? So similar to string, so we can duplicate the elements in our list just by writing *3. Okay, so if you have any confusion, so let's say I create another variable which I'm calling as duplicated loss functions. Okay, and just give me a second. Okay, so I write something like loss function multiplied by 3, and then I execute this cell, and then I can see what my duplicated loss functions, right? As you can see, yeah, so the elements have been repeated. So as you can see, these are the first 6 elements which we had originally. Then these elements have been repeated again here, and then one more, right? So there are 3 occurrences of each element, right? So each element has been repeated twice. Okay, so this is how we can duplicate elements in a list. Okay, so now let's move forward and talk about functions and methods, which will be very important topic, right? Because you'll be using functions and methods quite a lot whenever you are doing some processing or transformation or any such operation. So these functions will and methods will come in really handy to do certain set of predefined operations. Okay, so the first function is of course length, and we have seen this quite a lot before, right? So the length function, it returns the length of the list. So length is nothing but the numbers of element in our list. Now we have another function which is min. Okay, so main function returns the minimum element of the list. Okay, and min function only works with lists of similar data types, right? So this makes sense. Okay, so if I have a list of numerals, right? So list of elements, and these elements are numeric data type. So let's create this list which I'm calling as new list. Okay, and we can run this particular function or call this particular function by writing min, and within the parenthesis I'll provide the list variable name, which is new list in this case, and this will give me the smallest element or the smallest element in our list. Okay, so let's say if I increase this to 10, okay, let's see what it gives. So it will give us 3. Okay, so it just returns the minimum element of our list or the smallest element of our list. Now we have another function which is max. As you can see, so these functions, they return some uh, information about our list, right? So length returns how many elements we have in our list. Min returns which is the smallest element of our list, and min function only works with the list of similar data types. So for example, let's say if I add another element, let's say a string. Okay, so what do you think it should give us? Right, so type error less than not supported between instances of str and int, right? So there is no uh, logical way of comparing a number with a string, right? So that's why this operation less than, right? So when you talk about the minimum, right, so you talk about sorting your numbers in a particular fashion, right? So you sort your numbers in, let's say, ascending fashion, and you need to have a logical way to compare these elements. That's how you're gonna sort them. Okay, so but because we cannot compare whether a particular string, that is abc in this case, is greater than or smaller than 6, right? Does not make sense. Okay, so this will throw an error, and the main function only works with list of similar data types. Of course we can have a list of strings and that will work. Okay, so but we cannot have mixed data types when we are trying to use the min function. So I hope you understand this concept. So yeah, just let's run this. So yeah, so that's the question which Rohan was asking, right? So if you have any heterogeneous list, right, as in a list with mixed data types, so what should we do in case of min and max? So it will yield an error, okay, because there's no logical way you can compare a text with a number. All right. So moving ahead, similar is the case with max function. So max function returns the maximum element of our list or the largest element, and max function again works only with list of similar data types, right? So this is similar to min. Okay, so let's create a new list in which I have these strings, which is argue, right? So this is a list of strings. Earlier we had considered a list of numbers, but in this case we have a list of strings. So the only constraint when we want to use min or max functions is that our list should have elements which are of same data type, right? So here I can have list of strings. So I've written argue, I've written burglar, I've written parent, I've written linear, I've written shape, right? And as you can see, all so the first four elements, they start with a capital letter, and but the last element that starts with a small case letter. Okay, so let's see what this yields us. So if I run the or call the max function and provide this new list, so this will yield shape. Okay, what about min? Okay, so let's just run min here. So min will be argue, right? So it's sorted in a alphabetical fashion, and then it retrieves the smallest or the largest element, right? So if you're using min function, so it will extract the smallest element. So strings can be or words can be arranged alphabetically, right? So that's what a dictionary is, as in not a Python dictionary, but when you talk about any a normal English dictionary, so they have words arranged in an alphabetical fashion. Okay, so here uh, words with which start with capital case, so they will come before when we talk about sorting them in ascending fashion, and the words with smaller. So let's say if I have A, B, C. Okay, so let me just check this once. Okay, so I have A, B, C. Okay, so what is max of this? So max of this is again A, B, C, right? So because it starts with A, so it comes it does not come first. Okay, and if you provide min, so this will again be argue. Okay, so it's sorted in an alphabetical fashion, and depending upon that only it extracts the uh, element which is the smallest or the largest, right? So yeah, so I hope you understand the concept of min and max when you talk about a list of strings. Okay, so can you guys confirm if you, right? So if you are able to understand the concept of min and max function for a list of strings, of course this is pretty much straightforward for a list of numeric elements, but I don't think this should pose a lot of difficulty for you in terms of understanding how a list of strings will look like, right? Right. So you have a bunch of elements in your list. Let's say all these elements are string, uh, and then okay. So Gaurav is asking, sir, please repeat why it shows ABC in max, because when you, so here I'll tell you what's the sequence. So when you uh, sort your list in alphabetical fashion, so argue will come first. Okay, so this will come first, then burglar will come. Okay, then parent will come. Okay, and then you have linear, and then you have words starting with lower cases, right? So this is what will help you decide the sequence when you want to sort your list of strings. Okay, so okay, so you can talk you can explore about how exactly the strings the method of sorting works with strings. Okay, so it's essentially in this case, as you have seen, that the words are arranged in this particular fashion. Okay, and all right, so there are a lot of different intricacies which you can encounter, right? So maybe if you can have, let's say, a string which is one here, right? So you can have this, and then maybe you try to find out the max of this, right? So this will give ABC again, and what about min? So this will give you one. Okay, so there are different ways to handle these strings. So I can share the link with you, but for now we can skip this particular nuance, right? So these are relatively nuanced thing, and there will be very few occasions in which you will need to sort a list of strings. Okay, so because I just wanted to take an example that min and max functions, they work with lists of similar data types, right? So there are a lot of intricate nuances, and I don't want to delve into them. Okay, so let's move ahead, and I'll share the link with you guys. So how actually all these things are decided when you're trying to sort a list of strings. Okay, so that's not the agenda. Today we want to understand how we can transform or apply any such operation on a list, and what sort of operations are possible even, right? So there are a lot of inbuilt methods and functions which we can implement on a list, and let's see what operations those are, right? So there is another function which is sum. Sum function returns the sum of the elements of the list. Sum function only works with lists of numeric data types. Okay, so let's create this list, which is new list, and then I can sum this list. Okay, so this only makes sense for numeric data types. All right. Then of course you understand that sum function, they work only with list of numeric data types. Then we have a sorted function, right? So a sorted function returns the sorted list. Sorted function takes reverse boolean as an argument. So of course when you talk about a function, so don't think about a function in Python, but think of a general or generic function which does a particular task similar to sorting, right? So what is sorting? You arrange elements in a certain sequence of or fashion, right? So either it can be increasing order or it can be decreasing order, right? So in when you talk about this function, so what you need to provide apart from that, so you can provide the boolean argument which is reverse, right? So you can provide reverse is equal to true or false, and that will uh, sort your list in that corresponding fashion. Okay, so let's take an example. So you have new list here, and so you can call the sorted function. So you write sorted here, and within the parentheses you provide your list name or the variable name, and then it will sort the list in ascending order by default, right? So I didn't even have to define the uh, argument which is reverse, but we can of course do that. All right, so let's use this particular argument. So what this tells Python, that sort this list but in reverse fashion. Okay, so let's try to execute this one. Okay, so now this list is sorted in a descending fashion. Okay, now you can check your new list. This is still the same, right? So calling a function, right? So as you can see, this is the list which we had from here, right? So same as this one, right? So even when we call this sorted function, it didn't change the list, right? So calling a function will not change your list. Okay, so keep this in mind. So here we applied the sorted, we called the sorted function, and the argument we provided the list which we want to sort, and we had an additional argument which was reverse. So it tells the Python that sort this list, but not in ascending fashion, do it in descending fashion. So it will sort the list in descending fashion, and but it does not change the list. Okay, I've been telling you that yeah, list objects are mutable, but you have not seen any instance of such thing, right? So you have not seen any such instance where the list is uh, getting changed, right, by just doing one operation. Okay, so calling a sorted function, it does not change our list. Okay, so moving ahead, so let's talk about different list methods, right? So list methods are methods associated with list objects in Python, right? So I told you yesterday about methods, right? So methods are similar to functions, but they are only built for certain objects. As in, methods are functions specific to certain objects, right? So you cannot have a lower method for, let's say, a list of for, let's say, a numeric data type, right? So they are only fixed or only certain functions which we can associate with a particular data structure or an object. Okay, so that's what the difference between functions and methods. So functions are sort of generic constructs which give us uh, uh, some functionality to perform some operation. But methods are also similar to them, but they are defined for certain uh, objects, right? So they are not universal, but they are restricted to the scope of those objects. So these things will be discussing in a lot detail when you learn about functions and methods in next week. But for now, just keep this in mind, right? So methods are sort of special functions associated with a given object. Okay, so let's create a list and let's explore different functions with this particular example. So I have created a list which is called my list, and this particular list I have this bunch of elements, and as you can see, one has been repeated 4 times, 3 is also repeated 2 times, something like this. So let's go ahead and create this list. So my list has been created. Now let's talk about the first important method which is available for a list object. Okay, so you have this my list, okay, which is nothing but what we have written here, and as you can see, the length of the list is 10. Okay, so that means this list has 10 elements. Okay, so now I want to append an element in my list. Okay, so let's comment this out. Okay, so let's just, so how do I call an append method? Okay, so I'll write the name of my list or the list variable name, write dot, and then it will show me a bunch of methods which is available with a list object, right? So yesterday, remember when we mentioned dot, so Python suggested us some specific methods associated with strings. So similar to list, there are certain methods which are inbuilt, right? So there are some methods which are supported in Python, and we can use these methods to perform certain operations, right? So as you can see, there is an append methods, clear, copy, count, extend, index, insert, pop, remove, reverse, sort. So there are a bunch of them. Okay, so let's talk about append for now, right? So when you talk about append, right, so it will show you, yeah, this, right? So append method, it permanently adds an item to the end of a list. Okay, so the append method takes the element which you want to add to the list as an argument, right? So it makes sense. So you're using some functionality, right? You're using some functionality to add an item to the end of a list. Okay, so how do you do that? Okay, so when you talk about this append method, so this append method should take some input, right? So the element which we want to add to the list, right? So that's why it will have one argument. So let's provide something in our argument. So maybe I can provide this element, let's say 40. Okay, so let's do this. So now I want to check what my list is. Okay, so I'll just print this. Okay, so now as you can see, 40 has been appended in our list. So what I did, I just wrote my list, called the append method on this list object, and provided the element which I wanted to add, and I just ran this, and then this changed my list object, right? So as you can see, earlier we were having how many, 10 elements. Now we can check, right? So yeah, so now I can check the length of my list. So what is it? So it's 11 now. Earlier we had 10. So this is the first instance where you are seeing that it's very easy to mutate a list, right? So you just call this method append, right? And of course, whenever you are, let's say, designing a language, right, or such as Python, so you have you create certain objects or data structures, and then you build some methods and functions for those objects, right? So because lists have been defined to be mutable, that's why we have this method which is called append, which will append an item to the end of the list, and it will it will just change our list because a new element has already been added. Okay, so as you can see, the length of our list is 11. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. So append method changes our list. We saw methods from the last class, such as, let's say, lower or upper in the case of string, so that it returned us the corresponding output. Okay, but it did not change the string. So that means the strings are mutable. as in if we apply any methods on top of them in this simple manner, right? So I'm not assigning this to, let's say, my list. I'm not writing something like this, right? I'm not writing something like this. What I'm writing, I'm just writing, sorry, yeah, so I'm just writing my list. I'm calling the append method, and in the append method I'm providing the argument as the element which I want to append to the list. Okay, so this will change my list altogether. Okay, so as you can see, the length of my list is 11 because a new element has been added. Okay, so you can run this again and a new element will again be added, right? So 40, so as you can print your list, so 40 has been added again, right? And now you can check the length of my list, so it will be 12. Okay, so I hope this makes sense to you guys. Okay, so can you confirm if the append method makes sense? Okay, so perfect. So this is a very straightforward method, right? So as I told you, so calling the append method changed my list, and yeah, so that's what that's why these methods are there. Otherwise, if lists were immutable, these methods would never exist, right? So it's sort of a cause effect situation that I want to have a certain data structures or objects in Python in which I can do much more than, let's say, the other type of data structures, right? So for example, in strings, I was not able to do any changes. I was not able to append any character to a string, but I can do that with a list. Okay, so because lists have been designed and invented in keeping that thought in mind, right? So I hope you understand this important point. So let's add another element, which is 1.43, and then we can print our list, right? So as you can see, it has been added to our list, and whenever you call any such method, so this will change our list. And this is the meaning of mutability, right? So that means list objects are vulnerable to changes. Okay, so whenever you are passing around list here and there, so you need to be really careful, right? So uh, if you're calling any method which will change your list, so you need to be very careful when you're writing those codes. Okay, so it might happen that sometimes you're expecting that the list object has 10 elements, but later down the order you're seeing that your list, due to some operations, the size of the list has increased to 15 elements. So that can happen. So you need to be really careful. Okay, so now what we can do, we can add a list to a list itself. Okay, so here in the append method, the argument which I am providing is a list. Okay, so earlier I was just providing a single element such as 40, something like that, but this single element can be a list too. Okay, so something like a list of 1 comma 2 comma 3. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and see what our my list is now. So as you can see, this element has been added. Okay, so this list is just one element of the bigger list. Okay, so let's say if I want to extract the last element of this list, so what it will be, so I'll not write it here, I'll just add another code cell. Okay, so I want to extract the last element of this list. So this is nothing but this list which we just have added. Okay, and now if I want to get the last element of this list, so what I can do, so because this is a list, and then again I can provide square brackets and write -1. Okay, so this will return me 3. Okay, so essentially this operation extracts you this particular element which is 1 comma 2 comma 3, this list, and then when you call this square brackets -1, so this will again extract the last element. So essentially what this operation does, it extracts the last element of the last element of our list. Okay, it might sound strange to you, but this is what it is, right? So it's in a way we can have nested lists. Okay, so we can have a list within a list. All right, so you need to be careful with these, and I hope you are able to get this particular point. So how am I getting 3 here? Okay, so this is nothing but the last element, which is your one list that has 3 elements, and then you call another square brackets and provide -1. That means we want to retrieve the element sitting at the last index or the last element, right? So this will yield me this particular element 3. Okay, so I hope this is clear. Now let's talk about another method which is really important, extend. So we can use the extend method to merge a list to an existing list. Okay, so extend method takes a list or any iterable, so you don't have to worry about this particular term iterable, so we'll be encountering this in the future classes. So extend method takes a list as an argument. Okay, so the definition of extend method is we want to merge a list to an existing list. Okay, so what this will take as an argument, so it will take a list which we want to add. All right, so let's check our list, which is my list, right? So this is the list which we had from earlier. Now I want to add a list of elements, right, like this, right? So what are the elements which I am having in this list? So waba laba and then dub dub. Okay, so in this case my input is list, of course. So this extend method, it takes an input list as an input. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. Okay, now I can check my list, right? So here now I'm not having any list, but there these three elements have been added as separate elements in my original list. Okay, so extend method, what it does, it merges a list to an existing list. So unlike this particular operation which we saw here, right, so a list was added just as an element, but here in the case of extend, when we pass this list in the extend method, what it does, it adds all the individual elements to this list. Okay, so now you can check the length of the list here, right? So extend method also changes our list. That's very logical, right? So earlier we had very few elements, but now we have 17 elements, right? So these three elements have been added, right? So rather than just as a list, which will be again a single element, because a list is again an element, right? So you need to understand this very important concept. So a list is also an element, right? Of course a list can have elements within it, but if you see from outside, a list can also be considered as an element. Okay, so Smoothie is asking a very good question. So extend is similar to adding two lists using plus. It is what it is, right? So you can write a function which will mimic the property of extend method, right? So what will that function be, in which you are just adding list plus and then the list which you want to add, and you're assigning it to list, right? So let's say if I wanted to write a function which will do a similar operation to extend, so it will be something like, of course you don't know how to write a function yet, but I can tell you. So just follow with me. Okay, so you don't have to worry about this keyword. So for example, let's say extend function, okay, something like this. So this will take an input as the list which we want to pass. So this will take a list, let's say I call that a list or list. Okay, and what we can do here, so and then of course let's say we pass our original list which I call as list1, in which we want to inflict the change. So what I'll do, I write list1 is equal to list1 plus list, and then I'll return list1. So don't worry about this particular function for now. Of course you will be learning about this, but I'm just trying to say that if I call this function and provide the inputs, so it will give me the same output as the extend method, right? So let's try to run this. Okay, and how can we call this function? So you don't have to even worry about that, but I just want to show you how this is working, right? So let's say I have this particular list, right? So maybe what I can do here, so I can write a dummy list as this one, list to be added. Okay, so this is the list which we want to add. So maybe I can call this, let's say waba and then laba. Okay, now I need to pass. So my first argument is list1, which is right, so which is dummy list in this case. So I'll just write this here, and then I'll provide list to be added. Okay, and then So this will return me like this. This is similar to what extend method does, but as you can see now, if I print the length of my dummy list, okay, so I'll just print the length of my dummy list. Okay, so okay, so one thing first, I'll need to add this piece of code to another block so that you are aware of the differences between the two method ways, right? So the length of this dummy list is 14. Okay, all right. So this is, I'm calling the function now, but does it change the list of the length of our list, right? So it's again 14, right? So I've just called this function, but it shows me the corresponding output, that is the added elements. But if I just check the length of this list again, which is the dummy list in this case, it does not get changed, right? So the extend method is in a way a proxy for this extend function, but what it does when we call this method, it changes the list altogether. Okay, so it's the same thing what we have done here, but it actually the extend method, it changes the list. Okay, so I can skip this for now. You don't have to, yeah, bother about function for now. All right, so now you understand the concept of extend. Can you guys please say yes if you have understood this? Yeah. All right, that's great. Okay, so moving ahead, we have a lot of methods to cover. So these are very intuitive and very easy methods to understand. Okay, so another method is pop. Okay, so we use pop method to pop off an item from the list. Okay, so which item do you want to pop off? Right, so that's the natural question you will like to ask yourself, right? So if I tell you there is a functionality which is called pop, and it pops off an item from the list, right? So the natural question for you will be, which element or which item do we want to pop off, right? So that's a very generic question which you'll ask. So that's why pop takes the index as an argument, right? So and it returns the element which was popped off. Okay, so let's go through this particular functionality. So let's see what our list is. Okay, so this is our list. Now I want to call the pop method, and let's see what it does, right? So by default, pop takes off the element at the last index, right? So if you don't provide the index or the index, right, corresponding to which you want to remove that element, so if you don't do that, so it will take off the last element, right? So let's run this. So my list dot pop. Okay, so one thing is pop takes the index as an argument and returns the element which was popped off, right? So in this case, this pop method is popping off this particular last element, right? Because I've not provided the index, and it returns the element which was popped off. Okay, so now let's see if it changed our list at all or not, right? So as you can see, my list has been changed, as in the last element has been dropped. Okay, so when you call the pop method, it returns you the element which was dropped off, but if you inspect your list again, so you'll have the list without that element. That means the pop method changed our list, and it popped off the last element, right? So in this case, we of course we did not provide the index, but of course we can do that. Okay, so in this case, let's say if I have if I want to drop the element at the third index, so can you tell me which is the element at the third index, index 3? So this is 1, right? So the fourth element. So let's say I provide 3, so this returns 1, of course, and let's see what our list is. So I can just move it up above. Okay, so let's see what it is. Okay, so it is 1 comma 2 comma 3, but here there were 3 ones, but here we can see only 2 ones, right? So the one element at the index 3 that has been popped off. Okay, and when you call the pop method, right, so the argument will be the index, uh, the element, so we'll provide the index, and will the element sitting at that index will get popped off. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward, and you can check the length of your list. So it's 15 in this case. So earlier it would have been 16. So we can count out. Of course, we didn't print it, but you need to be really careful when you're using methods such as pop. Okay. So if you just write this, if you just write this particular statement, it will change your list. Okay. So it's very careful when you are handling list or whenever you are applying any methods to a list. Okay. So you need to be wary of these things. Okay. Now let's talk about another method, which is remove. So we'll use remove method to remove an item or an element from the list. Okay. So by default, remove removes the specified element from the list. So we need to provide the element. So in the case of pop, we needed to provide the index corresponding to which we wanted to remove that element. But in the case of remove, we'll specify the element as an argument, right? So the element which we want to remove from the list. Okay, so let's see what our list is again. So it has these elements, and let's just also print the length so that you can keep track of the changes. So the length of this list is 15. Okay, now what we want to do, we want to call the remove method on this list object. So right, so you remember the format. So write the name of your list variable, write dot, and you then write the name of the method, and then within the parentheses you will specify the arguments for that method, right? So some methods, they don't have any argument, right? But some methods will have arguments, right? So here in the case of remove method, I am specifying the element which I want to remove, right? So in this case, let's say, of course, append me is not part of our list, so I'll write waba. Okay, so let's see if it works. Okay, so now I can print my list. Okay, so now as you can see, waba has been removed from the list. Okay, so this we can do. We can also remove this particular list element here, right? So this is the list which we can remove. So in the remove, we can provide this element which we want to remove. So let's run this too, and we can print, right? So as you can see here, this list has been removed from our my list. Okay, and now we can check what is the length of our list. So it's 13, right? So initially we had 15, but we ran two remove operations, right? So there is the first one and this is the second one. So two elements were removed. So that's why the final length of our list in this case is 13, right? So we remove two elements. All right, and then we can remove one. Okay, so what will happen in this case, right? So if you have repeated elements, then let's say in this particular example, you have one here, you have some other ones here. So what will happen if I try to run this? So let's go ahead and run this, because this is our playground and we want to experiment as much as possible. Okay, and I would encourage you guys to implement and experiment with whatever ideas you are getting, right? So then only you will be able to understand what's happening, right? So it has dropped the first element, right, by default. Okay, so it has dropped the first element, right? So whatever the first occurrence of the element with that same value, it will remove that element. Okay, let's remove the third three. Okay, so there are two threes here, so let's see which one gets removed. So of course I'll write another code. Okay, so my list dot remove, and then I can specify 3 here, right? So which 3 it will remove. So I can print my list again. So it removes the first 3, right? So as you can see, the 3 which is after these two ones, that is intact. Okay, so the first 3 has been removed. Okay, and now I can check the length of my list again. So it's 11, because we have removed 4 elements since the beginning, right? So initially we had 15, but we removed 4 elements. So one was waba, and then was this particular list element, and then we had removed 1 and then 3, right? So So I hope you guys understand how pop and remove method works, right? So can you please confirm over the chat if you have understood so, right? So this is again a pretty straightforward concept, okay? So nothing much to bother about, right? So you have to think very logically, right? So and given a method such as remove, right? So what it will do, right? So remove at max, it will remove an element from the list. So you have to think in that way, okay? And things will become really clear to you, okay? So what a particular method does and what changes it inflicts in our original list, okay? So now there's another method which is count, okay? So of course, can you tell me here? Just give me a second. Okay, so can you tell me? So there is a count method. Okay. So do you think this method is related to mutability or immutability of list? Do you think? So you have a method such as count. Do you think it says anything about mutability of list? Okay. No, it does not say, right? Because the if you just go by the terminology, so it will count what this will count. So it will count the total occurrence of a specified element in the list, okay? So this method has no relation or no business with talking about mutability of list, right? Because uh, the basic functionality with which it is doing, it's just returning us the count of a specified element in our list, okay? So let's take this example. So we had my list from above, and here as you can see, uh, one has been repeated twice, okay? So let's count lava here once. So how do we call the count method? So we again write the name of our list variable, we write dot and we write count, okay? And within the parenthesis we provide the element as an argument, right? So again the count method is quite intuitive. When we talk about count method, so the definition is it returns the total occurrence of a specified element in the list. So that's why it's going to take some input, right? It does not know which element you want to return the total count of, right? So we need to specify that element whose count we want in our list, okay? So let's count the number of times lava is appearing in our list, and that's just only once. What about the element one? Okay, so let's count it, and yeah, so this returns 2, as in there are 2 ones, okay? Let's count 40. Let's count 40. So how many times 40 is appearing in our list? So it says 2, right? So as you can confirm, so there are 2 elements with value 40, okay? So this is again a pretty straightforward method, right? Now we have another method which is index, okay? So the index method returns the index of a specified element, okay? So let's print our list which we have from earlier, right? So this is the list which we have now. Now the index method, it returns the index of a specified element, right? So when you say that it returns the index of a specified element, so naturally you will say that this element will go as an input to the index method, right? And that is indeed the case. So here I can write lava, right? So I first write the name of my list variable, and then I write the name of the method, which is index, and in the argument I write the element whose index I want to get, okay? So let's run this, okay? So this says that yeah, this is an index 10, okay? And we can confirm. So if I write my list and I in the square brackets I write 10, so this should give me lava, right? So I hope you get the idea. So the index method returns the index of a specified element, and again the index method has nothing to do with the mutability of the list, okay? So there is no such information which we can discern by using the index method, right? So at max it just gives us the index of the specified element. Okay, what about if I write 1? Okay, so what it will return? So this returns 1, okay? It does not return the index of the second one, which was 2, right? So index method returns the index of the first occurrence of a specified element, right? So this is my specified element, which is 1, and it returns the index of the first occurrence of that element. Okay, so let's try to find out the index of 40, because there are two 40s, right? So this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the first 40 is at index 7 and the second 40 is at index 8. So let's run this. So it returns 7, right? So it returns with the index of the first occurrence of the element which I have specified in the method argument. Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So now let's talk about sort method. So remember from above we had used a sorted function, right? So which also sorted your list in ascending or descending function, and of course all the elements should be of same data type, right? So that's the constraint when you whenever you talk about sorting. Okay. So let's see how the sort method works. Okay. So I have a list here, which is the new list. Okay, in this case, and it has these bunch of elements. Okay. So now I can call the sort method, right? So I write the name of the list again and then write sort and then provide the parenthesis, right? So in the case of sort method, it's not necessary that you provide any argument, right? So by default, it will sort the list in ascending fashion, as was with the case with a sorted function, right? So let's run this and see what our new list is, right? So now, as you can see, your list has gotten changed, right? So here the elements were not ordered, but when I called the sort method, it changed my list, right? So sort method changes your list. You need to keep this in mind, but sorted function did not do this, right? So when I wrote sorted, and then in the parentheses, I provided my list object, right? So it returned me the sorted list, but when I checked the or printed out the list, it did not do any change to my list. Okay, but in the case of a new list, right? So you need to call right. So the sort method, it will change your list. Okay, so we have not specified anything here, right? Though there's no default argument. Uh, so the default argument is, of course, let's sort the list in ascending fashion. Okay, but we can use this argument which is reverse, same as the one which we have encountered in sorted function. So you can write reverse is equal to true. Then what it will do, it will reverse your list in descending, it will reverse your list. Okay, so this was your list in ascending fashion. Now this is a list in descending fashion. Okay, so the reverse is equal to true. That means that we want to sort the list but in descending fashion. Okay, uh, all right. Okay, let's talk about another method, which is reverse. So reverse method reverses the list. Okay, so so do you think in the reverse, so in the case of sort method, you had this constraint of elements of same data type. uh, just give me a second. Yeah. So now can you tell me here, if do we need to even bother about if we have something like a reverse method, right? So it says that reverse method reverses the list. So can you tell me if it actually we need to consider that all the elements are of same data type? Do we not need to do that, right? Okay, so yeah, so we don't so we can have a mix of elements, we can have elements of different data types, and reverse method will work as fine, right? So it is only concerned with the relative position, right? So the first element will become the last will become the first, and so on and so forth, right? So yeah, so we sort of reversing the list. Okay, so let's take an example here. So my list is this. Okay, and I'll print my list here. Okay, so now again I call the reverse method. So on this list object, or the right, so I write the name of the list variable, I write dot, and then I write reverse, and then uh, basically there's no argument, right? So reverse method is pretty much straightforward, right? So we do not need to provide any argument to this. It will simply reverse the list, right? So we don't need to provide this function or method any information about what it is doing, right? So it says that I'll just give me a list, I'll reverse the list. Okay, so it does not it only keep in mind the list which we have which on which we are applying this method, right? So that's it. We don't need to provide any additional arguments or inputs. Okay, so I think I've already run this. Okay, no. Okay, so let's reverse this list and see what happens, right? So the my last element is the first element now. The first element is the last one, right? So the list has gotten reversed. Okay, so this is again pretty straightforward. Uh, okay, we talked about nested list earlier, but I'll just recap this. So a great feature of a Python data structure is that they support nesting, right? That means we can have data structures within data structures, right? So for example, we saw above that we could have a list within a list, right? So in this particular example, I'm considering three lists. So these are list one, list two, list three. Okay. Now what I can do, I can create a list of list. So how can I do that? So I'll write the square brackets and then I'll write the name of the individual list here, right? And separate them by comma. Okay. So let's run this. And you can print your list of lists, right? So this is what it is. Okay, so yeah, one more question for you guys. So let's say if I want to extract in from this list the element D, can you tell me what indexing method should I employ to get this particular element D? So can you write it here, right? So I want to get this particular element D, right? Okay, so let's see what are the answers you guys are giving, right? So uh, so Himanshu is saying list one and then two. Okay, let's see if that makes sense. So the element with index one is the second element, which is again this list, right? And then you write another on top of this two, right? So the two will be corresponding to the third element, right? And it will give me D, right? So this is the correct answer, right? So I can, yeah, so let's say yeah, this is the correct answer. Okay, so make sense. So I hope you guys have been able to understand uh, how lists work in Python, right? So we went through a lot of different properties of list. Okay, then we talked about important functions and methods which are available for lists. Okay, so let's go to the quiz, and yeah, and after that we'll try to wrap up this session. Okay, so be ready for the quiz. So open your phone and be ready with your Kahoot app. Okay, I'll just share the screen. Yeah, so the stanza is saying list one bracket minus one. So that is again correct because there the index two and minus one coincide because the list is only three elements, right? So that's another way. Okay. So list one comma minus one. So this is what Prashant has written. So that is also correct. Okay. So this is the correct. This is also correct. This is also correct because your list has only three elements. So two and minus one. These indexes they coincide. Okay. So I hope this answer your doubt is clear. Okay. So let's